disorder or secondary trauma among first responders? And can you share what you know about that?
Yeah, the data, I guess, as kind of a starting point, post-traumatic stress, that's a normal response that probably everybody within the first responder community has. Those are just our responses to those traumatic exposures, whether they're encountered in person or we hear them vicariously through the stories of other people, that type of thing. As far as post-traumatic stress disorder, the data that we have is kind of a comparison with the civilian population. A lifetime prevalence among civilians is about 8%. Among police and fire, however, it's about 20%, at least 20%. Among EMS, it's at least 30%. So we see a pretty marked increase in post-traumatic stress disorder once we get into first response communities. As far as secondary, there's not a lot of good data on the vicarious trauma, the secondary exposures, but there's no reason to believe that type of discrepancy wouldn't be prevalent as well between first responders and the non-first response community. But I think you hit a big point there. What kind of accounts for that numeric difference is these are cumulative events generally, and we get exposure after exposure for 20, 30 years. That builds up, and then I think you can factor into that things like sleep deprivation, and the different social supports that we may have as part of our work, and law enforcement works a shift, and then maybe they work their part-time job, and then they have to be in court, and then they immediately have to go back on shift. So there's a lot of factors that really work against us and our ability to deal with those issues as they come up in our lives, and they kind of get filed away in the wrong spots in our brain, so to speak, because we don't get the rest we need. And then we see them manifest in greater numbers in our communities.
Okay. And so Angela, given all that what first responders are dealing with is just the normal day-to-day routine of their life, what is the culture in terms of, it is a tight-knit community, it's a different type of culture in terms of dealing with stressors and these types of issues. So how does that tight-knit community factor into help-seeking behavior among first responders?
Well, typically we don't seek help. At least for police officers, I think, we carry burdens by ourselves our whole careers, and those things just keep stockpiling because we're not good at dealing with them independently. So we don't seek help generally until it's too late and some kind of intervention is forced upon us because of behavioral issues or discipline. I think officers see asking for help as a sign of weakness. They're scared for their careers and how that'll be affected. They think everyone will know their business. And then we compare ourselves to each other. So I certainly can't have anything as bad as the next guy because of the things that person has seen, or someone comparing themselves to me. And then we just don't put into perspective that our own experience is our own experience, right? And what someone else, two people could be on the same call and walk away with two different perspectives. So we have to stop doing that. It's not fair to us, and that's what keeps us from being healthy, I think. So, we think everybody else is handling their stuff, and so we probably won't come forward because we think ours is too minimal or something, and no one will understand us. We're pretty confident that no one in the world can understand us. But honestly, there are very few culturally competent clinicians for us to turn to. I think that's getting better and better, but there aren't a lot of folks who know the police and fire culture well enough for officers and fire service to feel comfortable sitting in a room with them and pouring their heart out. Honestly, I think one of the best promotions for seeking help would be to hear a success story from someone else. So anyone who sought counseling or had a good experience with a professional, that would go so much further for all of us, I think, than any training or any flyer we could read.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, because that's a perfect segue into the next question I was just about to ask Brandon, because with what you've both been talking about, how first responders see other people's trauma, and this is a repeated cumulative event, if you don't seek help, or if you just bottle all that up, that can take a toll, and that can result in some pretty unhealthy coping mechanisms and behaviors that can be destructive. And so, but like you said, there are many people who find themselves in that spot, but do seek help and have a positive outcome from that. So Brandon, if you could just share some of your experience along those lines and what got you really interested in wellness for first responders.
Yeah, absolutely. I got involved in all this through some lived experience. I started out as a volunteer firefighter. I joined as soon as I could. Whenever I turned 16, I joined down in Southern Indiana, the local volunteer fire department. I started driving ambulances soon after that as well, and became an EMT as soon as I turned 18. And that's one of the risks of working in a smaller town, and particularly working as a volunteer, is you make calls on people you know regularly. One of my first calls was on my great uncle who had been shot in the head. And that's kind of one of the unfortunate realities of smaller service. At that time I was 8, exposed to some pretty serious trauma before then as well. And there was no way on earth I was prepared emotionally, maturation wise. I was not ready to deal with that type of exposure. Fast forward a number of years and of service, eventually getting on in the career fire service. There was a period in the middle there where I was also an attorney, where I practiced. I was a prosecutor down in Southern Indiana. But my heart was in the fire service. That's what drew me to it. I really wanted to be a firefighter. So I left that, joined the fire department, and continued on with the traumatic exposures and sleep deprivation, and not talking about the things that I'd seen and the things that were bothering me. And I was self-medicating with alcohol, which is not uncommon at all in public safety. When we look at alcohol use disorder, at least in the fire service, we have a rate of about 30% of our people are diagnosable with alcohol use disorder, compared to 5 to 6% of the civilian population. So a 500% increase in the fire service. And I have no doubt, as a prosecutor, I hung out at the FOP as well. I have no doubt that those numbers are also high in law enforcement, EMS, among dispatchers. That's a common coping mechanism. So if you look at that scale for alcohol use disorder, if you have 2 events in a year on that scale, it's diagnosable as a mild alcohol use disorder. I was 9 out of 11 for a number of years, very severe alcohol use disorder. I had a positive breath test at work. I came in, I got called from my random drug screen and blew positive. I had alcohol in my system from the night before. I had no idea. I thought I was going to be fine. It wasn't even in my mind that I would possibly have alcohol in my system. I did. I got suspended. Fortunately, IFD has a really good employee assistance program. So I was referred to our EAP, was able to get sober. I had a great social worker who was culturally competent, worked with me for weeks to get better. But as part of that, we say that sobriety is the gift we keep by giving it away. So I knew service work was going to be important to me. So I wanted, how can I get involved with this? I know I'm not the only firefighter that had this issue. So what can I do to get involved? So we had at the time a CISM program with IFD. So I got trained in CISM through Jerry Baker. A lot of us get trained by Jerry. He was my instructor. I did that week-long training, and then we switched to a peer support model a couple of years later, and just worked my way up through the ranks of our peer support team into a coordinator position, where now I do full-time, help firefighters and their family members get access to behavioral health treatment, addiction counseling services, all of that. I was able to get a job with the International Association of Firefighters as the peer support instructor. So now I'm able to travel the US and Canada and help fire departments set up their own peer support programs. I've been able to get some other certifications like my certified recovery specialist and certified addiction peer recovery coach. I recently took a PRN job with IU Health in their virtual care hub as a recovery coach. So I help people in emergency departments who have overdosed, things like that, to get into treatment. So, I mean, really the bottom line is, if I can go from 9 out of 11, which if you look at that scale for alcohol use disorder, that's really up there. That is problematic behavior. And I did that for 10 plus years. I consumed alcohol at that level. And here I am now doing a webinar on, with MHA Indiana and the Suicide Prevention Network. People can get better. People recover all the time. It took me getting in trouble to get that help, but there are so many resources out there, myself included, that are willing to help people get the help that they need, that people can and do recover from these issues. And we're fortunate with IFD that Chief Malone supports that. And that's why we've been able to build up the program here the way we have, is that top-down support. But I just encourage anybody, if they're having those issues, reach out and get the help, because you can recover if you want to. I'm living proof.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for what you're doing to help other people who are also in that stage where they're seeking help now and want to be where you are now in your recovery. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And I know we do have some questions popping up in the chat, and Dave Berman is monitoring that for me so that I can focus on our presenters here. But we will have time for some Q&A at the end, and we'll get to as many of your questions that you're putting in the chat box as we can. Angela, I want to turn to you just to talk about, because there are these stressors, and if that's the job you're in, going in, there's going to be some of that, but you may not always realize the extent of that until you're actually in it and living it. But everybody also has their home life, and in whatever form that takes, family, friends, people who count on us. And so how do you balance that professional stress versus just normal home life stress when you've got to go between those two worlds? And what can you do to focus on resilience and protective factors to try to help manage that?
So I'm kind of in a unique position. It's a male-dominated profession, public safety, on both sides, and being a woman has its own unique qualities. For the most part, though, well, I'll say, I'm not trying to say I'm treated differently. It's just when I come home, I'm mom and I'm a wife, and I work with a lot of officers who go home and are dads and do a lot of the housework. They are always on task for cooking that night and doing all kinds of things, and still have to get to bed in a timely manner and get up and do work all over again and do family all over again. And it's really stressful, and we don't get a lot of sleep when you work shift work. We're trying to get to bed in order to get 7 or 8 hours, and that never happens. That means we'd be going to bed at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and that seems unnatural. So it's 10, 11 o'clock, and we're working on 5 or 6 hours of sleep, and that catches up with you after a while. So balancing your professional and your home life takes work ahead of time. So I would encourage all new folks coming into public safety, especially if they're married, to start having conversations so early, outside of any crisis, outside of anything bad that's happening, but talk about what's our communication style going to be like when something bad happens at work. Or do I feel like I can call you and let you know something's happening, or would it be better if I text? For me personally, I will text my husband and just give him, some kind of update. Hey, bad day, or we're on a bad run. I'll probably be late, and I'll call him at some point, and he knows, that I will. And when I get home, he just kind of takes over for me if I need to. If he needs to take on dinner or help with our son or what have you, then he can do that. But when you don't have any of that pre-communication down, then in the midst of crisis, you're going to be a mess, and you're going to go home and take your mess home with you, and it's going to cause so much strife. And that's, communication, no matter what profession you're in, what your life is, communication's key, and it's almost always what fails us, right? Because we just don't do a good job of it. Mm-hmm. So if we can work on some of that, like I said, pre-crisis, then I think things can be so much better. We have a orientation program at the police department, and we bring on new officers. And when our crisis intervention team, or critical incident stress management team rather, gets a hold of them, we also like to bring in their spouse, and we get them for a couple hours, take them to lunch, and just, especially if they're a new hire and not a lateral, we kind of this is what you can expect during your FTO process and maybe in the first few years. And these are resources that would be helpful to you as a family. And as a spouse, here's some things you can specifically expect. And we have a great spousal support group headed up by one of my coworkers' wives, and it's just been fantastic. And they work with a mental health provider and do weekly like webinars, and just have a lot of tools for spouses to get through this career as well. I think some of the resiliency things we can do, obviously some of those simple things, eating, sleeping, as much as we can, eating healthy, drinking lots of water, limiting our alcohol use. Brandon, I will absolutely agree with you. Alcohol abuse is prevalent in police force as well. But things that might help are, mindfulness practices, breathing techniques, meditation, especially before we go to bed, and try to purge some of that junk that's, no matter if it's just your personal day or professional day, and really being intentional about caring for yourself. And then I'm a huge proponent of mental health checkups. I wish more agencies would do that. But if your agency doesn't do that, why not do that for yourself? We go for a physical every year, and why not do a mental health checkup and get a baseline? And if we do that as new public safety personnel, we have something to go on as we go further along in our career. And we have someone that can kind of help keep us accountable for those things. Mm-hmm. So those are just a few things I can think of.
Mm-hmm. All right, I appreciate that. Thank you. And you've both talked about, you both brought up the term cultural competence when it comes to a counselor or therapist to try to talk to about the stressors and what you may be dealing with. So Brandon, I want to just ask you, what do you mean by that in terms of how it relates to first responders? And what are 7 things that you would look for in a counselor or therapist, and why those things? Why are those things important?
Yeah, sure. So we, and the cultural competence is different even between EMS, law enforcement, fire, dispatch, all those groups. We share a lot of similarities in that we're expected to work and solve problems no matter what's going on, no matter the danger, we have to figure it out. So we share those similarities, but culturally we still have some differences. But overall, for a clinician to understand, what is our schedule like? How do we interact with one another? Like on our side and the fire side, when we're at the fire station, what are we doing? Like what is life at the fire station like? How do we address one another? If you were an outsider looking at the way firefighters talk to one another and the way we interact inside the firehouse, you would think we all hate each other. But that's part of how we interact. So understanding that, hey, this is actually a sign that these folks get along, is important, and that we don't take that type of activity personal. So those are kind of the cultural competence issues. And like on the law enforcement side, I mentioned, what's it like to work a swing shift and then pick up a security detail at night and then have to be in court at 9 or 10 the next morning to go back and work another swing shift and work your part. Like, how do you live that life? When do you sleep? So understanding how all that works together is really important for a clinician. The 7 questions that we ask, and this is some work that was done by the International Association of Firefighters. And I encourage anybody who's curious about resources for first responders, if they just search IAFF, behavioral health, in Google or whatever, one of the links that comes up will be the IAFF behavioral health page. Everybody who's interested in this should go there, and there's so much information and downloadable PDFs and coursework. It's an amazing site. But this is where these 7 questions come from. And so the first question that we would ask is, does a clinician have experience with us, with police, fire, first responders? That's number 1. If they don't have that experience, it's not a disqualifier, but we need to know that they're willing to get that experience, because that is where the cultural competence comes from, is actually spending time with us. We also want to know what evidence-based treatments the clinician uses. Primarily, we've found that standardized time-limited treatments are best for us. They tend to be better suited for traumatic exposures, which a lot of us come to the table with, as well as depression and anxiety issues, again, very common in our population. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, EMDR, those are really good treatments for the first responder community. Also, those types of treatments will a lot of times have homework involved. First responders want to play an active role in their own treatment. They don't want to sit back and have someone treat them. We're fixers by nature. Tell me what I can do to help make myself better, and I'm going to be more likely to do it. So those types of treatments involve homework a lot of times, which also works well for us. Another important question is, how many sessions is it going to take you to do your initial assessment? If it takes more than 2 sessions, we're going to lose interest as first responders because we think you're dragging your feet. When you call us to come help you, we figure that problem out in 15 to 20 minutes, and we're working on resolving it. Whether or not it's realistic or appropriate, we expect similar treatment when we reach out and get help. We want help quickly. Another reason that assessment being done quickly is important is because by the time we reach out, a lot of times we're either in crisis, we're acutely symptomatic, or we're functionally impaired somehow by the time we reach out. So getting an assessment and treatment going quickly is really important because we're usually in pretty bad shape by the time we actually make the call to get help. Related to that, can we get in within 24 hours? We have a really good relationship with our employee assistance program where if I call or our chief of peer support calls, we can get people in same day or next day. That's really important for the same reasons as before. When we want help, we want it now. Do we have a 24-hour number where we can access a clinician? Things like that, or we want to know how quickly can we access somebody who can help. We'll also ask if the clinician has a relationship with any inpatient facilities. ERs are always an option, particularly for law enforcement, and for us, they're not always our favorite option because we know a lot of the people who work there. We're concerned with stigma. We don't want to go into a facility where maybe you've ID'd somebody as a law enforcement officer, you've detained somebody, and now you're going through the same system. So if we have clinicians with those types of relationships that can get us in quicker and smoother, our people are a lot more likely to ask for help. If we can work out those relationships with facilities where we can maybe come in a side door rather than having to go through the main lobby, that can also assist us with reaching out for help because we can maintain our privacy and avoid some of the stigma issues a little bit easier. We're also always curious whether or not a clinician works with the prescriber. Getting that medication and streamlining that process is very useful. Additionally, if a clinician regularly works with the prescriber and we all work together, there are some medications that are allowed for first responders and we can still report to duty, and some medications we can't. And that's, for driving apparatus, for law enforcement carrying weapons, some we can't be on some substances. So working out those relationships ahead of time with prescribers via the clinicians we're going to use is really helpful if we need medication, to make sure we're getting medications in a way that if we can still report to duty, we can do that. And then finally, are you willing to engage in some type of experiential training? Whether that's, the IFF has Fire Ops 101, which is kind of a one-day fire academy where you put on the gear and crawl through a heated environment and see smoke and all that, and kind of gives you a little bit of exposure. But there's always ride-along options. You can come visit a firehouse, eat supper with us. If you want to get to know firefighters, sit at a kitchen table with firefighters, and you will hear things you never thought you would hear a group of people talk about very casually. But that's important to know. Again, that's our culture. Same with law enforcement. See about doing a ride out, get in a police car and ride with a cop and see what their shift is like, what they go through, how they're treated, how they have to deal with situations. Again, that all goes to that cultural competence piece. But those are the 7 things that we look at whenever we're trying to vet a clinician to send our people to.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you for going through that. And in terms of providing support for first responders, there are a variety of models out there, different approaches. So I want to ask you both about some that you each have experience with. Angela, I think you've both referred to CISM or CISM a couple of times during this chat this morning. So can you tell folks what that is and what the model is, and then how you apply it in your community?
Sure. So CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management, is an intervention tool. It's developed specifically to address traumatic stress, traumatic events. The goal is to lessen the impact of that critical incident and normalize someone's reaction to it. We're trying to restore folks back to their healthy day-to-day function. And we can assess, the need for further intervention and refer folks to services if needed.
And can I ask a quick question just for folks who may be listening that aren't familiar? When you say a critical incident, how is that defined, or what would be an example of that?
So it varies. There's not a real clear-cut definition or example, but anything that causes stress to a point where maybe folks can't seem to function in the shift, or the whole shift experience something, and the majority of shift experience something together, and they're having a hard time processing it. So it could be, obviously line of duty, death or injury, major events where we're responding to, the death of, or a traumatic event out in the public, sudden infant death, just depends on what it is. And generally we count on supervisors to kind of assess how their folks are doing and reach out to see if, a CISM or a peer support intervention would be appropriate. So it's always an open conversation to have to see, what might work best. It is not psychotherapy. It is a peer-driven program supported by a professional mental health partner. For us specifically, our team has kind of waxed and waned for members, but we have had our same mental health partner, Kimball Richardson, for several years. And Kimball has been fantastic in helping to support us. And we've been actually utilized many, many, many times throughout the state to provide intervention to other agencies. So it's been truly an honor to do that. But the techniques that most people would be familiar with when they hear about CISM is a debriefing. So that's a very structured group setting to work through that critical incident. That usually would take place within about 72 hours of the incident. And that's always kind of up in the air as well. It depends on what's going on, whether or not we could actually get that in 72 hours. I believe, when there's a funeral to take place, do we assess, do we need to do something prior to a funeral or after? Do we need to do both? Touch base again afterwards. So again, we're relying on the agency and working with them to help us work through that process. I would say most often used is a one-on-one concept where a peer and an officer get together and just checking in on each other and kind of helping walk through that process of what that incident was, if we don't need to do a formal debrief. Our team began about 12 years ago, and it was inspired because our neighboring agency had 3 suicides in a very short span of time. And our goal was to mitigate any stress for officers that were in crisis before anything like that would ever happen. And, we've been able to do that and get folks back in service and keep folks healthy. But the ultimate goal is to keep them healthy along their career, instead of, like I said earlier, if it all accumulates and we never deal with it, we are setting ourselves up for complete disaster. And I will say, personally, my ultimate goal is to make sure people can retire and have a very long retirement. So if we can purge all that junk along the way, and CISM program is designed to help do that, then you're setting up officers for success.
All right. Very good. I appreciate you explaining what that is, because when we hear that term, I think it's helpful for folks to know what that is. And Brandon, you are involved in also another peer support program that you've started or that you're involved in. So can you talk to us about that? And also, I just wanted to ask you to touch on the debriefing that Angela talked about, that it can be formal, or sometimes you can have something more informal. So if you can talk about that and how that may vary between the various types of first responders, what the benefit of that is, and then what your peer support program is.
Yeah. And so I think sometimes in the circles that I run, there can sometimes be a little conflict between CISM and peer support, like it's a one or the other deal. And I've never viewed it that way. And in fact, I have done our peer support work in conjunction with CISM responses as well. I think they can work very well together. We just have a little different approach to what we're doing, but they're both very good tools in the toolbox. So when we talk about peer support, it is, in my case, it's firefighters helping other firefighters. But depending on the discipline, that's really the key. Though we look at lived experience as kind of our connecting element there. So that's why a firefighter helping another firefighter. We don't trust anybody the way we trust our own. Angela talked earlier about that close-knit grouping. That's how we are. Firefighters don't trust anybody the way we trust another firefighter. So that's kind of where we get started with the peer support model. And we engage it in a few different ways. We're originally with CISM, as Angela mentioned, is really focused on that traumatic event or that potentially traumatic event and responding to make sure that people are receiving the care they need to deal with that trauma. We found that that's a great model to use for those. We needed to expand it a little bit for the firefighter who, say, was going through a divorce and needed resources to get through a divorce, or maybe having financial issues, things like that. So that peer support, our goal is to serve as the bridge between the firefighter and the services they're trying to access. That's really the simplest way we can put it. So it's very broad spectrum in what we do, but we serve as basically a resource manager. We engage in 5 different ways here. We do routine visits to fire stations. So when nothing is wrong, we will call or stop by a firehouse, one of our peer supporters, and just have a conversation at the kitchen table where we talk about our program, how to access EAP, maybe talk about some other resources. But our goal there is basically just to normalize this conversation about behavioral health. When you can actually sit at the kitchen table and say, hey, firefighters have depression, firefighters have PTSD, firefighters have alcohol problems, and you can verbalize that and have that discussion, it becomes more normal to talk about it. People are more likely to get help. We also do requested visits. So a firefighter or a fire officer will reach out to us and say, hey, we think this is an issue. Can you help us deal with it? Then we will do those requested visits as well. We do respond on traumatic events. So we have that mass casualty incident or member death, that type of thing. Where we differ from the CISM model is we don't do debriefings. When we visit, we don't talk about the incident. That's one of the big differences between the two models. And neither one is wrong in the way we do it. We just have a different approach. So after those traumatic events, we will initially call the fire station, talk to the officer, say, hey, how's everybody doing? Does anybody need to come offline right now? Is everybody functioning? And then we let them know, hey, your next shift, which is 72 hours later, we're going to send a team out. A couple of us are going to swing by just to talk to you all about what resources are available, talk about good coping. We just want to make sure that you have the information you need in the event that your people need help. And then we're in and out. It's pretty quick. So we, on our end, we're not trained in peer support to do those debriefings and to facilitate that. CISM is. That's where that can really come in to moderate that aspect of it. We also engage in education. So all of our recruit classes, peer support, behavioral health comes and talks to them. When we promote officers within our agency, we go and talk to the officers again about behavioral health to reinforce that people can get help. Here's our resources. We also do incumbent training for all firefighters within our agency to make sure that they get repeated exposure to behavioral health treatment or behavioral health education. And then finally, if we know somebody's been off work for a couple of weeks, we'll have a peer supporter just reach out to them. Whether we think there's a behavioral health issue or not doesn't matter to us. We just want to make sure if you've been separated from this world for a couple of weeks, we know firefighters start to make poor decisions whenever they're separated from the fire service for a couple of weeks. We get lonely, self-medication can start to take over. We're really taken out of our element. This is a third of our life is at the firehouse. So Having one of our team members reach out just to check in means a lot to our members. And that's really how we engage across the board in 5 different ways with our people through peer support.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And it seems as though it also, there, like you said, there's different experiences even between the different types of first responders. So possibly after an incident where multiple agencies responded, if you're with the fire department, you might be heading back after that incident with another person in your vehicle and can talk about that or process that. Whereas if you're law enforcement, you may be in a car by yourself and then you're back on the road and really just kind of there with your own thoughts and not able to. So I think it's good to hear that there are different models out there and different approaches that are available, because there's really no one size fits all, since there's different experiences going on there.
And I might even add, one of the reasons that peer support works really well in the fire service is, particularly the career fire service, is that I know where everybody's going to be every 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be at that firehouse and I can get there and talk to them. That's a lot more challenging with EMS and law enforcement. They don't have a house that they're at. They're constantly responding and roving. It's a lot harder to make that type of model work on the fly the way we can do it in the fire service. So I think that also accounts for why we see these different models and how they can work differently in the different agencies and different disciplines.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you said about normalizing the conversation about behavioral health, that it's okay to talk about, and hopefully, we'll see more and more of that across all of the different first responder agencies and departments, because I think that is an important culture shift that hopefully we're moving closer to, is really making people just feel comfortable having that conversation, because it's the reality of what you deal with. And Brandon, I also wanted to ask you, in terms of some folks are volunteer, say, for example, volunteer fire, fire department personnel, and others are in it for their career. How would you describe the difference in terms of what we're talking about today with these stressors and trauma and supports, or just the experience of those two when you look at the volunteers versus the career folks?
There are obviously some pretty significant differences. Angela earlier was talking about resilience, and one of the key resilience factors that was mentioned was social support. In the career fire service, we have a lot of social support. You have the people from your apparatus. Maybe you're in a fire station with more than one truck, so you have a fairly, eight people, perhaps 10 people at your fire station, and you're all very close, very tightly knit. So we have a lot of social support on the career side. The volunteer side doesn't have that same type of social support. You respond from home. You deal with the incident, you get back in your car and you go back to work, or you go back home. Maybe you go to the station and help clean up, but it's not the same type of fraternal or that same type of close-knit environment that we have in a career firehouse. I think also there's just the reality of funding and differences. A career fire service, we have employee assistance programs. That's one of the, I think, requirements that's made available to career firefighters. It's not the same on the volunteer side. There's some, like Vincent's Township Fire Department is exceptional. They actually have employee assistance benefits for their volunteers. That is a rarity for understandable reasons. So unless those volunteer firefighters have some type of behavioral health benefit through insurance that they have through their full-time job, they just don't have the same access to particularly free behavioral health care like we do through an EAP on the career side. Some things that we all do have access to, though, are like the Indiana resilience and emotional support teams. Those district teams can be called upon to do the CISM responses anywhere within the state to help those fire departments out. Indiana State Police have helped out with CISM responses in the volunteer world as well. There are, as peer support has become more popular, we see a lot of peer support teams around the state. We have one here in Indianapolis. Our local through the IAFF also has a team. Evansville, Lafayette, Kokomo, Lebanon, Anderson. We have a lot of peer support teams that are willing to go to those volunteer agencies to assist. That's something that we do. Chief Malone has made a point that because we're the largest agency in the state on the fire side, if people need help with behavioral health, our team can help out with that. We make ourselves available to help track down resources and make those connections because we have that ability. I think those are really the big differences. The point that I would make, though, is even if you're lacking in those EAP benefits and that social support, not to hesitate to call on something like the REST team or CIT to come out and give you help. That's what we're here for.
Mm-hmm.
And even if those agencies or those response teams aren't available to come to your agency, they will find someone who is, because we want to see somebody respond to help out those agencies. But there are some big differences between the career and volunteer side as far as just those resources and how available they are to their people, no doubt.
Okay, thank you. And I know we're getting close to our Q&A. I am going to ask Angela a question here, but if you are watching and you have questions for either of our presenters, you can go ahead and enter those into the chat, because shortly here, David's going to be starting to give those to us so that we can get as many of those answered for you as we can. But Angela, I wanted to follow up on what we just heard from Brandon in terms of, you know, there are a lot of big departments, whether it's law enforcement or fire or EMS and other areas, but there are also a lot of small ones, rural places that may not have as many resources or access to support. So what would you say, and what kind of message would you want to share with anyone who may be watching regarding wellness and suicide prevention and healthy coping skills and supports for first responders across the state or wherever they may be?
Sure. Well, first of all, if you happen to be in an agency that doesn't have a CISM team or a peer support team, I think you've got two resources right here with Brandon and myself. You know, just like his chief has allowed their agency to, you know, go out in the state and assist, we've been given that same honor from our administration to do that as well. And if we can't do that, we can find somebody in the state to come help you. So that's not a problem. The Indiana FOP Critical Incident Memorial Team can help, you know, find somebody somewhere in the state to help law enforcement. We've helped fire departments. It doesn't matter. When it comes to public safety, we're all in this, and we'll get you the help that we need. I know Father Dan Coffey with Indiana State Police Chaplain is on the webinars also, and he heads up the Indiana CISM network. So it brings together teams from all over the state, and there's coordinators. So there's always communication and always a connection to get folks resources that they need. You know, I started this career 23 years ago. I had my first traumatic experience actually in the police academy when my PT partner, we had just come from running outside. It was January, and we had a few minutes of rest before we started doing our push-ups. At the time, they would pair you up. One person would put their fist down on the ground while the other person did the push-ups, and my partner, Jimmy Martin Miller, was doing that for me, and he suffered a major cardiac event and died right there. I had no idea, you know, I'm brand new and really not even in the job yet, and this has happened, and I was so impressed that the Law Enforcement Academy brought in some kind of team, and we had some kind of meeting where we all sat in a circle and worked through the whole process of Jim's death. And I didn't really understand what that was, except for the fact that it was helpful. And fast forward to the point where our agency decided to put a team together, I realized that had been a CISM debriefing, and it was Indianapolis Police Department's post team, their peer officer support team, that had come to do that for us. I was able to reconnect with one of the members from that team that was there at that debriefing, and I gave him credit and that team credit for my interest in helping others and a place for me on our team. So, you know, I've been able to pay that forward. And, you know, I've experienced several personal traumatic events with my own police officer friends, and let alone the countless times you're responding to a call for help and helping people in crisis and comforting them and what have you. But at the end of the day, any of us, police or fire, can feel like we are alone, that we have to be the only people feeling this. And even though, yes, this is what we signed up for, how much more can we take? Yet we continue, and it's a 20-year career, but we're here for, 25 and 30 years because we love what we do. And, now we're looking at a time in our society that I never thought we would get to. I never thought we would get to a point where law enforcement was so demonized. I can't believe we've gotten to a point where police officers are being called murderers, and the threats and the defunding of our agencies, it's heartbreaking. And I know when I began my career that it's possible I wouldn't come home one day, and I was okay with that. But I know that my brothers and sisters in blue are not okay with being called murderers, and not okay with what's going on, because the vast majority, more than the vast majority of this, do this job because we love helping people. I know that sounds cliche, but that is why we do this. We want to make a difference, and we want to help people. And I would just encourage all of us on the police and fire side, our 911 operators, they're sitting there sometimes feeling helpless because they're taking these calls and they're hearing radio traffic back and forth, and they're hearing their officers and they're hearing their fire and EMS folks on the radio, and they can't do anything to help but sit there and listen. So they're affected. We need to always make sure we're remembering to include them when we have interventions. But just want to remind us all that we're not alone. We have each other. There are so many people out there who do support us. We have a wonderful community where I work. And honestly, the majority of folks, I think, still do love our public safety. They just maybe don't know how to say it right now. But if you are feeling alone and feel like you have the energy to ask for help, please do that. If you see someone that needs it, please reach out to them. If you're the person being asked for help and you don't know where to turn to, take that person alongside you and find an answer. Don't give up until you find someone that can help you. We've all made great relationships and have met so many people in our work experiences, and that made incredible impressions on our lives. So we can't let these negative things outweigh the good and rob us of the joy that we've experienced. And so I would say we need to work on our perspective, be intentional about caring for ourselves, because obviously you're no good for others if you're not good for yourself. And we've come a long way in both police and fire service in understanding the stresses of our job, normalizing the conversation about those stresses, maybe getting better at calling each other out when we see one of our shift mates or someone on our squad, isn't quite right, that we have the courage to ask how they're doing and try to intervene if possible. So making those resources available and keeping us all healthy. And again, as I said earlier, primed for a very well-deserved and long retirement is the ultimate goal. I don't want to do this when I'm 60 years old. I want to be in an RV somewhere or on a beach somewhere. So, and I want that for everyone else. There's a time and a place for our careers and to let the next generation come in. So just, it's easy for us to say, go get help when you need it. Well, that's really, really hard. And when you feel like you're alone, it's even harder. So I would task every one of us to be watchful of each other, and again, be courageous enough to confront that person if necessary and ask them how they're doing and pry a little bit, because sometimes it's just that moment where we think no one cares about us, and that person just asking how we're doing lets a little bit of light in and lets us realize that, we are cared about and people do love us. So, and for sure, not not thinking that we have to control everything. That's just not reasonable, not possible. But yet we put pressure on ourselves all day long to control everything in our environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that serenity prayer about realizing what you can control and being okay with what you can't control and asking God to give you the wisdom to know the difference. I know I didn't say that verbatim, but the idea is not being so focused on, you know, what's gone wrong and what we can't control, but look back and see all those things that have been good and enriching in our lives and try to change our perspective. Because in the end, like I said, we want to kick back and put our feet up and look back at all the good stuff and let that next generation take over for us, and be healthy.
Very good. I appreciate that. Well, I just want to thank you both so much, and we are about to transition into our question portion of this talk, but thank you for really taking this kind of deep dive into suicide prevention and wellness for first responders. I know there's been some questions in the chat about will participants today get a copy of the resources and the webinar? And the answer is yes. After the webinar is over, you're going to receive an evaluation. And as soon as you submit the evaluation, then you would have access to get the webinar. And David Berman, who is also going to be moderating our questions here in a moment, the executive director of the Indiana Suicide Prevention Network, is going to provide that resource page. So when you get it, if there's anything that we talked about today that you don't see on there, just follow up with us and reach out, and we'll try to get you whatever information you need. So with that, David, I know I've seen some questions coming through, but if you can kind of take a look at those and start us off there with questions for Angela and Brandon.
Let me start by saying that I just uploaded in the chat a document that we put together with a number of suicide prevention resources, including some that Angela and Brandon have given us for first responders. As Marianne said, after the survey, when you have access to the webinar itself, I will also make sure that that is resent out to everyone. So let's see. First question. When you talk about first responders, do you include correctional facility staff, and what does support potentially look like that might be different for them than other first responders?
For sure, correctional staff, especially in our local sheriff's departments that have jail and corrections as part of the agency, we've always included them. We've always included our dispatchers. I know that, I believe, David, I don't know if you were a part of, and Kimball are a part of something for Indiana's DOC, but yeah, and I know they're represented on the CISM network. So for sure, they are a part of our fraternity.
Okay, Brandon, you mentioned an alcohol scale. What scale are you referring to, and was it the fire department that used it?
So the scale I'm referring to, sorry, I should have been clear about that in my discussion. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, is kind of the go-to manual for clinicians when they're diagnosing behavioral health and substance use conditions. Alcohol use disorder is one of those conditions listed in that somber looking tome. So there's specific diagnostic criteria for that. There's 11 questions that you're asked. For every question that you can answer yes to over the last 12 months, basically you give yourself a point. And then at the end of that questionnaire, you add up your points, and depending on where they fall on that scale tells you what level how severe your alcohol use disorder may be. So that the department didn't use that. That was actually a clinical diagnostic tool that was used. And it's interesting. We really don't talk about alcoholic or non-alcoholic now, or addict versus non-addict. We recognize that the process of the disease starts small, it's chronic, and it's progressive, which we've known for some time. And now that's finally reflected in the diagnosis that you know, two points out of 11 is considered mild alcohol use disorder. And then that just gets worse over time generally to higher and higher numbers. But the whole addict versus non-addict is kind of old language. And now we look at more of a spectrum of disordered behavior. But that's what I was referring to whenever I was talking about the scale.
Okay, I think this one might be for either of you. I know this is an interesting one that I've had to answer when I do trainings for first responders. How do first responders manage having access to lethal means all the time while struggling with mental health concerns? Any policies, formal or informal, that you might suggest?
Do you want to start that one, Angela, or?
Yeah, obviously, police officers, at the end of the day, police officers always have a lethal means. And, you know, there's a stigma. One of the stigmas about coming forward is that you'll take my gun. Well, the answer, or the issue there is that police officers don't just have one gun, and a lot of firefighters have weapons also. So I don't want to say, you know, what a policy should be. What needs to happen is that conversation and that confrontation with someone about asking them where they are in the moment, so you can assess what that crisis might be and where they, you know, are on a scale of needing help, and getting them to help. I would much rather someone hate my guts because I took them someplace to get help than for them to not be here anymore and me to have missed that opportunity. So that's for the administrators to decide on policies. But the conversation up front and prying and being a little nosy into people's business really can be life-saving.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, there is some training called CALM training, Counseling on Access to Lethal Means. That's offered by the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. If you go to sprc.org, you can find that training. It's online, it's free. All of our team members go through it. I take it every single year. But the point of CALM training is it teaches you how to have that conversation with someone who has indicated they're having suicidal ideation and they have access to lethal means. Well, what questions do we need to ask? How do we put some distance between that person and that lethal means? Because we know suicide risk can change rapidly either direction. So if we can put some time, some distance between them and that method, we can probably save their life and get them into help, at least, and keep them safe in the short term until we can get some definitive care. So again, everybody, if you have an interest in suicide prevention, I encourage everybody to take that free training, Counseling on Access to Lethal Means. It's online, do it at your own pace in your own home. I love that training. It's really good.
I would agree with you, Brandon. Okay. And I know this was answered in some way by Kimball Richardson on the chat, but there's such a stigma placed on CISM, critical incident stress management, that we all need to find a way to remove, especially in more rural communities. Any suggestions?
You know what, David, I honestly couldn't hear that very well. Can you repeat the crux of that?
Yeah, I heard that I'm warbly. Is this any better?
I can.
Not really.
I think I can repeat it for you. I think the question was, there's such a stigma placed on CISM, particularly in rural communities, and how can you work against that stigma for critical incident stress management?
I'm not sure exactly if that means that if a CISM intervention was offered, that people would be stigmatized for going, or because it may not be offered in places like that. I don't know. I can tell you, I have been a part of many CISM interventions where the cops come in like this and arms folded across the chest and don't want to be there, and you're not going to tell me anything that's going to be helpful, and this is dumb, and I'm not going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya with everybody. And when they walk out, it's obviously not what they expected, and there is a relief. There's always a relief in the room, and people will say how much they appreciated it. So I don't know if that question means the stigma for, you know, going through one or not having them offered, but I think we can destigmatize that greatly by, you know, having folks that have been through them give their experience of it, and I've been through them, and I've offered them, so I can give that experience as well.
And I would piggyback on that and say a big part of the stigma, in my view, isn't so much with CISM. It's just because it is behavioral health. That's where the stigma lies.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in an agency that potentially may need CISM, which is every agency that's out there, by the way, go ahead and front load that now. Take the time at your monthly meetings or whatever trainings you have and make behavioral health a component in that. Talk about CISM. If there's a potential you're going to need it, don't let your people feel like it's getting sprung on them. Actually have a discussion about, hey, there may come a time where we utilize this. This is what CISM is. And have a CISM trained person provide that information ahead of time. Because that's where the stigma, it's an overall stigma with behavioral health and trying to get help for that, in my view. It's not just CISM. If we can front load that, then when the day comes that, hey, a CISM team is coming, oh, okay, we've talked about this. I know what to expect now. I don't have to be scared of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's incumbent on the agencies themselves to take the time and train their people on these issues before it's a crisis, because that's the worst time to learn about anything is in a crisis. So front loading that, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I would say 100%, Brandon. I've unfortunately been a part of a debriefing where the group did not know that that's what was happening, and it was devastating.
Yeah.
I think we did more damage than help because we walked in thinking they knew, they didn't know. So your point to having the discussion prior to and making sure when an incident happens that folks know what intervention is coming. I know in CIT, and so many agencies or communities in the state are doing that. We end every week of CIT training with self-care of the public safety personnel. And so it's a great opportunity after they've, you know, learned all week about how to care for those in the community with mental health crisis to, okay, how do we care for ourselves? And going back to, you're not good for or others unless you're good for yourself. We in that empowering people to care for themselves and maybe what interventions might be available. And that might be a great opportunity for agencies to do that in their communities through CIT, just giving that little bit of precursor to something that would happen.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay, can you hear me any better now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. It was asked if we could get contact information for both you and Brandon, Brandon and Angela. Someone is looking to become a culturally competent provider.
Yeah, I can either put it in the chat box or however we want to do that. There are some resources that I think are available. I'm happy to share that, however you want to do it, David.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and put that in the chat box, and then we will resend it out with any information after the survey is completed.
Okay.
Okay. What about the cumulative effect of the exposure to trauma and how the current pandemic and civil unrest adds to that stress? This makes it much more than regular trauma exposure.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. If we thought it was bad before, and then the last several months, and at least for law enforcement, we literally went from hero to zero overnight. And for officers, for the ones that I'm, in contact with, thinking, is this what I want to do anymore? And for me, I'm past the point where I could retire. So if I decide I can leave, I can leave. That officer that's got 17, 18 years, that seems kind of stuck because they want to make sure they get that 20 years for their pension. They don't know if they want to do this anymore. And then that kid who thought, this is what I've always wanted to do. I've been in law enforcement 3 or 4 years. Maybe this isn't for me anymore. And it's, like I said earlier, it's just heartbreaking. The pandemic, I just looked on a statistic this week, 130 some police officers have died at what they're considering line of duty from COVID. And I don't know what the numbers are on the fire side, but I've realized how much our officers are impacted by the fear of not so much themselves, but carrying it home, and what lengths they will go to sanitize themselves prior to going back home. And you know, with the pandemic and being separated from each other, and then now to the civil unrest, it is it's a lot for us to bear. And that's now more than ever why we need these support services to come forward, and these culturally competent services to come forward to help support us.
Yeah, it's changed the way, you know, we would normally visit firehouses. We've had to change the way we do business to, you know, Zoom and calling people up. I did a visit to our dispatch center right when the protests were really hitting hard. There was one weekend in particular where the protesting was very heavy. And I went to talk to the control operators for Marion County just to let them know that we were available. And I don't know how they do what they do, quite frankly. Our dispatchers, they get hit hard no matter what. And when there's something like this going on and protests, and then the ensuing police activity and criminal activity following that, they were just getting creamed, and they get left out of this mix a lot. But it definitely has changed our outlook and our response. And I think it really opened my eyes even more to, you know, what the people behind the scenes, so to speak, are going through at these times. It was unreal. So if there are any dispatchers as part of this, I want to thank you myself for what you do. It is really, really hard work.
All right, this next one is for Angela. You had mentioned a yearly mental health checkup. Is there a document that you use for that?
No, but I can work on getting something.
Yeah, and if you're a first responder on this and you have access to an EAP, on the anniversary date of my hire, so June 4th of every year, I call our EAP and make an appointment and go in and talk to somebody just once a year. And that's how I remember it, is my hire date. So that can be a good option too. Your municipality's already paid for those visits, so take advantage of it at least once a year and get that baseline squared away with a professional.
So this one looks like it was meant for Angela, but I think it applies to both. Are law enforcement or fire workers able to get inpatient treatment without having their fitness for duty being questioned?
Nope. If an agency is involved in the intervention with an officer, then an evaluation is going to have to be done. Our administration a couple years ago got really good at dismissing the term fit for duty and calling it return to work, because no matter what, if I break my leg and have orthopedic surgery and have physical therapy for 6 weeks, and before I come back, I have to have a return to work visit to make sure I'm okay to come back. The same with the mental health concern, and that right there is where we can make huge strides. They are no different. A physical injury and a mental health injury are no different. We would treat them the same. I'm gonna have an evaluation, I'm gonna see a specialist, I'm gonna have treatment, and I'm gonna get back to work, no matter what that is. But people should expect a return to work evaluation. Now, if an officer or fire service was able to get services on their own and in such a quick fashion that no one at the agency knew about it, then no one would know about it. But that may be a disservice to yourself to try and cram something in. There are not a lot of inpatient care facilities that cater to public safety. They're very, very few. I don't know if the one I gave to David made it to the resource list, but there's one in Florida, Florida House Experience Health. They have a track called Shatterproof, and it's just for public safety. And they have addictions care as well as mental health care. So there are places out there, they may not be near us right now, but there are places out there that can do that. and help destigmatize for the person affected on what that would be like to come back to work.
Yeah, and we see it's very similar on our end. If you're off for 10 calendar days, you have to go through a return to work. So if you're going to, like say, a 28-day treatment, you're going to have to go through some type of return to work. But as Angela said also, if somebody can get into, say, an intensive outpatient program, we can do that and keep them working. We try and do that type of thing. We have our general orders have a confidentiality provision where our division of wellness and support, we're not allowed to be asked what we're working with people for. We have some confidentiality provisions that allow us some latitude to get people help. And if we need to get them time off, we can ask for that. And we're provided with that backup through the administration that we can get that time for people, which is huge. It's not always there. A lot of agencies don't have that type of top-down support like we do. But it's the same on the fire side. If somebody is off for an extended period of time, whether it's, like Angela said, a broken leg or because of an addiction issue, they just have to go through return to work to come back. So, but it's not punitive. Unfortunately, we view it as punitive sometimes because of the stigma attached to it.
And I would guess, Brandon, you can probably say this specifically, but once you're on the other side of that and in treatment and on the road to recovery, your perspective's so much different. You're looking at things through a much healthier lens, that return to work isn't as scary as you thought it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a weird thing. Once you get treatment and get better, whereas you were stigmatized before, so many of us coming out on the other side want to tell the world, hey, I did it and it worked. So do it yourself. Like it really does change your whole perspective. That's a good point.
And I want to add, our agency just did our first workman's comp claim for a mental health issue.
Wow.
And that was really exciting. We're still processing everything, but that's very new. And, you know, part of our mission needs to be to train workers' comp on what that means and why we would make a claim. But our fingers crossed that this is going to work out.
Good.
Oh, that's big.
Yeah, that is. That's great. For anyone who's recently joined, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. David, do we have another question for either?
We do. We have several, and I am going to reframe this for both Brandon and Angela. Is there something available for law enforcement officers or fire personnel to retire? One day you're a member of that community, and then the next, your days or weeks seem to be on your own. It's very hard for the first 6 months or a year once you don't have daily access with the peers that you've known for years.
We, on the fire side, we have retired firefighters are able to stay active within our local through the IAFF, which is our labor union. It's like the FOP, but for firefighters, if you're not familiar with it. So they're our bargaining unit, and after retirement, you're able to stay active with that. They have retiree lunches, retiree breakfasts, retiree events where retirees can get together with their peers and talk. We host a weekly Wednesday AA meeting at the local 416 Union Hall. That's open to all first responders, police, fire, EMS, dispatch, corrections, active or retired. So that's another peer connection that we offer through the local. Also, the local worked with Life Services EAP and got a series of visits worked out that retirees can take advantage of. They basically bought a block of EAP visits, and if retirees need those, they can call up confidentially, get a hold of local 416 and get access to an EAP visit or visits if they need them. So we're woefully behind the 8 ball on that because we're just now recognizing how much of our identity is really lost when we retire. I think we've always known it, but we've kind of ignored it because it was easier. We're finally starting to address that, and that's what we've done on the fire side here. And I think it's made a difference. So.
Yeah, I would say we're not as far along as you guys are. Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department has a really great retirement program, and reaching out to their wellness unit, if you're in law enforcement, could probably garner some really great information. But they do similar things where they have access for retirees, you know, well into their whatever they want to take advantage of.
Okay, we have, it looks like two more right now, which is probably perfect for the amount of time we have left. Is there anything specific you found particularly helpful for daily mental health care for those working in the criminal justice field?
So recently, the Center for Mindfulness, I'm going to butcher the name of it, in public safety, Brandon, maybe you can help me. They've been putting on a Wednesday night seminar, if you will, just a few minutes of a topic, and then Dr. Fleet Mull does a mindfulness practice where it's a breathing exercise or something, and it's been really helpful on Wednesday nights. I've really looked forward to that, and that's open to all public safety. And then, you know, one of the things I've been able to do, we ended up moving farther away from the community where I work. So that drive home for me is so therapeutic. And when I get into the community where I live and it's much smaller and we have more space, I've just psychologically been able to shed a lot of what's gone on through the day. And, you know, as addicted as we are to our electronics, if you can be intentional about not getting on social media, I absolutely do not get on social media. I have a Facebook account, and my church and the place where I work out are my only friends. And so there's nothing but positivity there, but that's something that everyone can do. And if you can train yourself to stay off of that, you'll be miles ahead. But any of the things that we talked about earlier, like again, mindfulness practices, you know, physical exercise, we all need that. And it works against us when we don't, but psychologically we have to have that physical exercise to get those endorphins going and to clear out the junk. So everything that we already said earlier, I'm not sure I could add to that.
Okay, and I think we have one last question.
Last question. Is there information on the training that response teams go through to make sure they are prepared to help first responders, for example, peer-to-peer or CISM, similar type trainings?
There are a couple on the fire side. I don't have the links. If there's something that's going out after this, I can share that with you, David, but the International Association of Firefighters has a 2-day training. A lot of that stuff is suspended right now because of COVID. But that's an excellent training. I'm an instructor for that. Illinois Firefighter Peer Support also does a 2-day training to help you set up those peer support programs. Angela could probably talk more about the ICISF and CISM stuff, but I can share that with you, David, to put into the whatever comes out after this, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, the ICISF, International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, headquartered in Baltimore, has been around for eons, and that program was begun with firefighter and psychologists, and so that program's been alive and well for many years. We are very fortunate to have a couple local trainers, Jerry Baker and our own Kimball Richardson. Kimball does that training with Dr. Lindy Holt. She's a paramedic with Lawrence Township, or Lawrence Fire Service. And that's a 3-day individual and group combined class. That's wonderful. And honestly, our team retakes that class every couple of years, just as a refresher and as a team builder.
Great.
And I just saw in the chat that Robert Olemiller sent to everyone for the mindfulness in public safety that Angela was talking about. His contact information is there. So if you want to make a note of that. And I also just unmuted Kimball Richardson if he's still on. Again, as Angela said, he is one of our top CISM
I'm still
trainers.
there. I'm here.
Okay. Maybe you can talk about a little bit what you're currently doing and where the state of CISM training is right now.
CISM training by the international, but first of all, by the way, Brandon and Angela, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, for being the host and moderator. You guys did an excellent job and are just primo representatives for first responders in the nation, truly. we're lucky to have you both here. So CISM training is available. Some of it is available electronically and virtually. They just started allowing that. I think most of us are still doing trainings in person where that's safe. We do have a training coming up August 31st. It might be full, but there may be a few seats available. I put my phone number and my email address in the chat in case anybody has a question for me, and I can get you guys in touch with a training. But I think we've got 2 or 3 other trainings still planning for this year sometime.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Kimball. I just wanted to, I know we're getting ready to wrap up here, so I just, again, want to thank Angela and Brandon so much for being here today and sharing your insights with this group. Thank you to everyone who was participating in watching the webinar. Please keep a lookout for that survey that's going to come out. So we really do appreciate your feedback. And once you've sent that in, then you'll get access to the webinar. And please keep a lookout for information about our upcoming Indiana Suicide Prevention Network webinars that are going to take place monthly from August through November as we continue this 6-month series. So thank you, everyone, and please stay safe out there. Take care.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.